Good morning or good afternoon to everybody, depends when you are listening to this lecture. Today I would like to tell you a little bit about the cooperation and a different geographical space with regard to MSP. These plans, they look very differently as a collage or something like that. Behind all those planning efforts must be done some coordination, or they require some coordination in order to achieve key important goals which are somehow agreed at the sea basin level. So this cross-border, and perhaps also not only cross-border, which means between the neighboring countries, but also BSR cooperation plays an important role for the coherence of the entire planning effort. And today I would like to show you how it is going on here in the Baltic Sea region in practical terms, how we are achieving this coordinated outcome in the Baltic MSP. First, a little bit about the legal basis, then about terminology, and then the main part of the lecture will be on the cooperation and the sea basin, which is Baltic Sea region level, and then about the cooperation between the countries which are affected by the concrete planning outcome, which might be a plan or some other planning document strategy. And then at the end, I will try to put those two perspectives, this perspective of the sea basin and this perspective of work between countries, neighboring countries together. What are the main important legal acts? The first one, which you know from the previous lecture, is EU MSP directive. And in this directive, in Article 6, we have a minimum requirements for maritime spatial planning. There are several such requirements, but as you can see, among them is transboundary cooperation. Here we have transboundary cooperation between member states and cooperation with third countries. And those issues are detailed in Article 11 and 12. And cooperation among member states, according to this EU MSP directive, the main aim is coherence and coordination of the planning efforts, so coherence of the plans, but also coordination of the preparation of the plans. Also, in this Article 1, it is clearly said that this is a task for the MSP authorities in the member states, so those public authorities which are responsible for MSP. And they can use the existing regional networks which are in the given sea base. Whereas when we are talking about the cooperation with third countries, so which countries which are not belonging to EU, so here we have a much softer language. So first of all, this cooperation is not the must, it's required, it's encouraged if it is possible, if the third countries want to cooperate. And in the Baltic Sea region, we have such a cooperation, both with Russia, but also with Norway to some extent. And also here it is said that this should be based more on the international law, international conventions, and also this existing fora, existing regional structures. They are mentioned as a right way of cooperating with third countries. But the focus is more on those international law and conventions, which perhaps they are also binding for those third countries. One of the key conventions which should be given attention by maritime spatial planners when preparing the plans. This is the ESPO convention on environmental impact assessment in a transboundary context. And this convention has a Kiev protocol, and in this protocol, in Article 10, there is a description how such a transboundary consultations of plans, can be different plans, but here we are talking about MSP plans, how such consultations should look like in a transboundary context. But what is important, this convention is of key importance because it was ratified by European Union, so which is binding for all countries which belong to the European Union in the Baltic Sea region, but also for other countries. It's a platform for cooperation also for the third countries. But what is important, what we should remember about this convention, is that this convention is dealing mainly with environmental impacts. Environmental impact, sometimes there is an attempt to extend this also to some cultural heritage issues, but this environmental impact, this is a core of those discussions. And as I said, this convention is establishing a very concrete institutional framework for discussion. So in each country, there is a contact point, there is an authority responsible for such transboundary consultation, and they are organized according to what is stipulated in the conventions. In general, it looks like that if we are starting maritime spatial plan, and the country which is preparing such maritime spatial plan is a country is envisaging the transboundary environmental effects or health effects. It should notify this to the other countries which are party of these conventions. And those countries, they have a right to respond whether they have interest to participate in such consultation. And if they have an interest, they express such an interest, they should receive the relevant documents. So for example, Polish MSP plan was translated, at least partially, but also environmental report was translated into English and sent. It could be translated also into national languages and is sent to those countries which wanted to participate in this ESPO consultations. And those countries, they have opportunity to give opinions, to make suggestions related mainly to this environmental impact. And then the country which is preparing MSP should respond to that. So this is convention, which means that it's legally binding. Countries preparing MSP to launch such a transboundary consultation related to environmental impact. Very important convention, which is binding here in Poland, but also which was signed by BSR countries, is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Here, in this convention, there is no direct stipulation with regard to cross-border or transboundary consultation, which would be relevant for the Baltic Sea region, with one exception. Because what is interesting is that this cooperation, which is envisaged in this United Nations Convention, is related to the area. What is area? This is a subsoil behind the high seas. In the Baltic, we have no high seas. We have only exclusive economic zones. Therefore, it's not so much relevant, but it's very interesting because this area, according to this convention, is a common heritage of a mankind. And because of that, this common heritage must be managed in the way of international cooperation. And there is a special authority which was established in the framework of this convention for managing the area. Countries which sign this convention, they participate in this authority. So very important, area is a common resource or common heritage of a mankind. Because of that, it requires joint management or coordinated management. As I said, there is one exception which is relevant for the Baltic Sea region, because here this exception is related to the protection and preservation of the marine environment, because according to the UNCLOS conventions, also cooperation on a global or regional basis is encouraged or is proposed for dealing with the protection and preservation of the marine environment. And we have such a cooperation. This is the Helsinki Commission in the Baltic Sea region. But as you can see, according to the UNCLOS, this is a very important issue, marine environment, because this is also a kind of a common heritage, which requires, so this is a logic in this United Nations Convention, that if we have a common heritage, it should be jointly or in cooperation managed. I presented to you this ESPO convention, which is binding for all EU countries. And on top of such, binding stipulations, we have so-called soft law. What is a soft law? Soft law, it means that we have a set of different guidelines, different principles. They were prepared by different authorities, but mainly by the countries which are making MSP. And because of that, those countries are committed to fulfilling them. And those principles, they play an important role because they are shaping practical way of this cross-border or even sea-based cooperation. So here I am showing you as an example, this MSP principles of EU. Here, the seventh principle is cross-border cooperation and consultation, so these are very important. We can notice that this cross-border cooperation and consultation principle was lifted in the EU directive as a kind of a binding requirement. But there is much more numerous pieces of such a soft law in the Baltic Sea region. Here we should remember that they play a really important role and they shape cooperation in reality. So here we have this transborder cooperation required by law. This is mainly about ESPO Convention, is related to the environmental impact. And then we have voluntary, transboundary, cross-border Baltic Sea region cooperation. And this cooperation is on broader issues, and it is based on different guidelines and recommendations. So we can say those guidelines and recommendations, they are somehow guiding transboundary MSP activities. So this is a broader scope of such activities. Now about terminology, which I will try to use till the end of my lecture. So you have noticed that we have transboundary cooperation. Usually this transboundary means that it is related both to multilateral sea basin cooperation or to cross-border interaction between neighboring countries. So here I am dwelling this slide according to the WASAP-HELCOM consultations on concrete planning documents. I mean, can be MSP plan, but it can be also a kind of a visionary document, or the document, because the planning can result in different planning documents. It can be a kind of a set of guidelines. So consultation on such documents, they are mainly between countries on cross-border level. So we have this consultation and cross-border interaction, which are focused on concrete documents. This is one piece of our puzzle. And the second piece is cooperation on broader issues, cooperation on different issues on maritime spatial planning, mainly knowledge exchange, but also discussing some innovative approaches to MSP, discussing some future of MSP, development of trust and common understanding. And all this is named by me here at the cooperation on maritime spatial planning or sea basin cooperation. I will use term BSR MSP cooperation. BSR is Baltic Sea region abbreviation. And this cooperation is usually of multilateral character. So it's broader because it's encompassing all countries in a given sea basin, whereas this cross-border can be limited because only those countries which are affected by a given document, or a given planning document, they take place. So we have those two parts of our transboundary activities. So consultation, mainly cross-border interactions, and cooperation, more general issues. And here we have sea basin level, Baltic Sea region level. And now I will start from this broader setup, so this cooperation on the BSR level. And here the key role is played by two organizations, HELCOM, which is a formal convention on the protection of the marine environment of the Baltic Sea region. And this convention is a legal organization, and all Baltic Sea region countries that participate, including Russia, and the HELCOM. And this is an organization which is responsibilities related to environmental issues. And here we have WASAP. WASAP is not a legal body because WASAP is a cooperation of ministers, voluntary cooperation of ministers, because ministers decided they want to cooperate on the issues related to spatial planning in the Baltic Sea region. WASAP is also responsible for MSP planning. And both together, those organizations, they are providing very important framework for doing MSP in the Baltic Sea region. And this framework is not only related to the soft law, which I described to you previously, but also for knowledge exchange, for building trust. And the main vehicle for doing that is HELCOM WASAP Working Group on MSP. This group was established on the initiative of WASAP, so Ministerial Conference in Vilnius took place in 2009, and in the declaration of the WASAP minister, it was said that such a cooperation is necessary. So the ministers responsible for spatial planning, they asked for assistance of those ministers responsible for environmental issues. And those bases, such a joint group was established 11 years ago, which was not an easy process because there were totally different ways of working. WASAP was much more flexible, HELCOM was much more regulated because it's a convention. But fortunately, after some discussions, this joint network of HELCOM and WASAP started to work very efficiently. And you can see that this WASAP HELCOM working group was adopted by the highest body of WASAP, which is a Committee for Spatial Planning and Development, in 2010, and the HELCOM Ministerial Conference in 2010 as well. And this was the beginning of the joint work. I am somewhere here, perhaps here. So I represented Poland, this body, which was a fascinating experience for me. Usually this group, which is composed of the representatives of the ministries. So usually we have here head of departments in the ministries responsible for MSP. Sometimes it differs because I was asked to represent Poland for some time, and they meet usually 2 times, 3 times a year, and they are discussing policy relevant issues. The first outcome of this group was a set of Baltic Sea broad scale MSP principles. So we tried to discuss, and it took us 2 years to finish this. So we tried to discuss here how this MSP should look like in practice. And part of it is also principle by coincidence, like in the EU principle number 7, transnational coordination and consultations. But the main discussion here, they were related to ecosystem approach, meaning of sustainable management, sustainable development, meaning of precautionary principles. So it was a very, very important 2 years of joint work, which gave us a common denominator of working in the Baltic Sea region with regard to MSP. Here you can see the 2 chairs, which played an important role because the rule is that this group is chaired by a person representing HELCOM, it was Anita Makinen, and by a person representing WASAP. Here you can see Andrzej Cieślak from Maritime Office in Gdynia. So both of them, they chaired the group and they were responsible for running all the discussions. Here you can see the recent meeting of the group, of course, online. So that's a big difference. But what I want to tell you is that here for our lecture, what is really important is the outcome of this group in terms of guidelines on transboundary consultation, public participation and cooperation. I will discuss these guidelines in detail because they play a very powerful role. And all countries doing MSP, they try to follow it. As I said, it's voluntary compliance. But because of the fact that those guidelines were prepared by those countries, so the countries, they want to follow them. And also of importance for our work is another set of guidelines, is the guidelines on MSP output data. What is MSP output data? These are data which are presented in a visual form on the maps. For example, different sea uses planned by different countries, but also not only sea uses, but how they are planned, when something is forbidden or something is allowed or it's prioritized. And because of that, those guidelines, they helped a lot. Why? Because I showed to you this first map when we put together, at the beginning I showed you the first map, when we put together all plans, at the first glance it looks a little bit chaotic. So, you know, those joint work on the joint map, on the joint planning map, will make this picture much clearer. So everybody can understand what is happening and whether we have no contradictions between the plans. So here, this is a very important contribution to advancing this coherence of MSP planning effort. I will not continue on that because I will focus on the guidelines on transborder consultation, public participation and cooperation. But please keep in mind that you can look on the joint maps that will present soon because the plans are not ready still. In some countries they are still under preparation, but you can look on the joint Baltic map presenting all the planning effects. You can see how it works. So Here we have this HELCOM VASAP MSP working group, which is a kind of decision-making body, but the decision of this working group must be endorsed by VASAP minister and by the HELCOM ministers. Then we have expert groups. We have now one expert group on data, and this group is developing concrete issues which then are discussed by the VASAP HELCOM working group. So these issues here, they were related to those Baltic maps. And then this work is supported by the VASAP and HELCOM Secretariat. And here it's very important that also the VASAP HELCOM working group is composed mainly by the representative of the public authorities responsible either by environmental protection or MSP, concrete planning in each country. So even it is composed like that, so the pan-Baltic stakeholders, for example, environmental organizations, they are invited. So they participated as an observer, so they cannot vote, but at least they know what is happening during those discussions. And some organizations, they are very active. Here you have the topics which have been discussed recently, but I will mainly refer to those guidelines which were important for us. We have a second layer of the Baltic Sea region MSP cooperation, because VASAP HELCOM working group, usually there we have people responsible for making key decisions on MSP in each country. But here in this lower level, we have a planner. So people, perhaps they are coming from the same organization. So they are coming from even the same agency, like in the case of Sweden, we have SWAM, this agency responsible for MSP, Swedish agency responsible for water issues, and they are responsible for MSP in Sweden, but their director is participating actively in VASAP HELCOM working group. He's a co-chair. And here in the framework of concrete projects, transnational project, we have a cooperation of people who are doing this plan, even they are coming from the same agency, from the SWAM. We have here not only people from different agencies responsible for MSP, but we have also scientists. We have some other stakeholders coming from NGOs, like, for example, Baltic Environmental Forum. It's very active in pursuing MSP. So here we have much broader and much more concrete cooperation related to joint important MSP challenges or issues at the Baltic Sea region level. So it is also Baltic Sea region cooperation, but now at the level of planners. And you know how it works. Here I can show you Participate project. As a part of this Participate project, we discussed transboundary consultation. So we made a kind of insight, we discussed it, we prepared some documents. Then these documents were lifted to the level of the VASAP HELCOM working group, and VASAP HELCOM working group prepared guidelines. And those guidelines were adopted by HELCOM and VASAP steering bodies. So you can see that there is a concrete cooperation between this project level and VASAP HELCOM more formally oriented level of cooperation. And there is a kind of a dialogue between them, because the VASAP HELCOM is also showing to those people responsible for MSP what are the key problems, what are the key challenges they should solve. And on those basis, some projects which are then financed by EU sources, so those projects, they were financed by DG Mare, those projects, they are launched, executed, and then the result of those projects, they are discussed by the VASAP HELCOM working group. Well, here I want to show you some key results. So the most important probably is the vision on Baltic plan, because this vision showed us what are the key transnational topics which required cross-border cooperation or even Baltic Sea region cooperation. They are related to marine environment, for example, blue corridors, transport lines, transport corridors, fishery and mariculture, and offshore energy, for example, connecting different offshore farms. So here we had the project which came up with those ideas, and then this vision was discussed by the VASAP HELCOM group and then adopted by the VASAP ministers, or endorsed, formally endorsed. Here you can see also this Baltic plan project. On this slide you can see that there were two cross-border plans which were prepared under this Baltic plan. That's very interesting. The third cross-border plan was prepared in this project, Plan Botnia. So this was a plan between Sweden and Finland in the Gulf of Bothnia. Here we have a middle bank plan between Poland and Sweden. Here was a planning effort between Denmark, Sweden, Germany, and Poland in Pomerania Bight and Arkona Basin. So those plans, they were not of a binding regulatory character, because as you know, according to the directive, the responsibility for planning is laying in national authorities. But those plans, they allowed national authorities to discuss very important concerns, how they want to plan those areas which are close to the borders of the country. So here is Swedish and Polish sea border. And those projects, they played a very important role because they somehow they resulted in changes in the regulatory plans. And here is also a very interesting issue. It's a comic showing the essence of MSP. It's also a part of project level cooperation. So here you can see the model, which is summing up what I told to you. So we have HELCOM Ministerial Conference, VASAP Ministerial Conference, we have HELCOM VASAP Working Group, and then we have a network of planning practitioners. This is done mainly in the way of transnational project, and all those layers, they cooperate each with other. So you can see that HELCOM VASAP Working Group, for example, they prepared HELCOM VASAP principles, and those principles, they affect regulatory planning. Or network of planning practitioners, they prepared this vision then was sent to VASAP, VASAP work on this vision, and once more this vision gave very important basis for shaping regulatory plans. What is of key importance of this network of planning practitioners is accumulation of knowledge, know-how, experience of MSP. So this external funding, usually Interreg of DG Mare funding, is important for this accumulation of knowledge and know-how, because this knowledge, know-how is then used accumulated mainly by the network of planning practitioners, but then it is used by HELCOM VASAP Working Group for preparation of key political documents on MSP. This is the way how we are cooperating in this BSR level. As I told you, this cooperation between practitioners usually at the beginning was done in the form of projects, but somewhere here there was a decision that we need to organize a kind of planners forum, which are planners forum which are organized. First it was Pan-Baltic Scope organized it, and then nowadays it's under Capacity Project, which is the recent project of MSP. And this level of practitioners is important addition to this planners forums. They create an added value to the normal meetings in the framework of the project. Why? Because in the projects we have different configurations of partners. Some countries are not so interested in some topics. So here this planners forum is a neutral way of meeting all people responsible for planning. And here I want to show you what is said in the VASAP HELCOM guidelines on transboundary consultation and public participation about this BSR cooperation. Those guidelines is telling that this model is the right one, it should be continued. And there was an issue of these expert groups, and those expert groups were added thanks to those guidelines, and this expert group on data was added. And also there is a kind of suggestions that the cooperation with other Pan-Baltic organizations should be strengthened. Perhaps the deficit of this model is that it's based mainly on the people responsible for MSP at different levels, but those affected by MSP, they are not engaged so vigorously as it should be. And then here you can see very important statement about informal cooperation. And in these guidelines, we have repetition of underlining that this informal cooperation is important. So we should not only work, but we should also discuss, but I will come back to this when I will show you this cross-border level. So now I'm moving to cross-border consultations. This entire part is based on this VASAP HELCOM guidelines on transboundary consultation, participation, and cooperation, which I told you they were prepared under Participate project. Those guidelines, they were adopted by VASAP HELCOM Working Group and then by relevant bodies of HELCOM and VASA. And here, at this slide, I'm trying to show to you the philosophy of those guidelines. So this philosophy is in line, which was said, as you remember, those guidelines, they were areas and MSP directive. But what is in the MSP directive? So it is totally in line with that responsibilities mainly on MSP authorities, national MSP authorities. They are responsible for planning, so also they are responsible for consultation of the plan. But despite of this responsibility, there is a need for related public participation process. So they should launch such a process. That's very important. They should launch such a process. So this process should accompany those discussions between MSP national authorities. And also those guidelines, they build on ESPO convention, but they are not contradictory to the ESPO convention, but they are telling very important issues. That first of all, consultation should not be only limited to the environmental impacts. They should be much broader. They should encompass, for example, aims and objectives of MSP, but also synergies, not only conflicts, because ESPO is mainly about conflicts. But also the very important observation or statement from these guidelines is that such cross-border consultations that should be started at the very early stage. So it should be started together with the preparatory stage of making the plan, elaborating the plan. So ESPO convention is when the plan is ready. Here we should start our discussion when we have an idea that we will start preparation of the plan. And now in these guidelines, you can see the steps which should be followed by those MSP authorities in each country. So we have a country which starts preparation of MSP plan, and when there is a decision to start preparation of the plan, there should be information sent to other countries. And here, what is the most important, that thanks to these guidelines, we know to whom we should send such an information. So we have MSP contact points. So there is a need to send a letter or email in English to the contact points or other countries that might be affected by our plan. In fact, we are telling these guidelines about all BSR countries and all relevant Pan-Baltic organizations to inform that our country is starting the plan and what is the nature of the plan. And this about intention as the nature of the plan, this is a very important issue. Why? Because we have different plans in countries. So, for example, Swedish plan is non-binding. And in fact, the most important decision in Sweden will be done at the stage of licensing. Polish plan is different because Polish plan is much more concrete and is binding and is deciding a lot of issues within the plan. So this information is important for other countries to understand what document will be prepared and what will be the impact of this document of their marine area. These guidelines are telling that if the country is preparing MSP, then it has a right to ask neighboring countries for relevant information and documents. So those countries should provide country preparing MSP with information which is necessary for proper development of such a plan. And this should be done also by these national MSP contact points, which were stipulated in this establishing of them, was an outcome of those guidelines. And then when we have public consultation of the plan, so when the plan is semi-ready or there is an advancement or preparation of the plan, so the parallel stakeholder process should be installed in the neighboring countries, the most important steps which are envisaged in those guidelines. And here I want to show to you how it was done in Poland. Of course, we can say that perhaps those guidelines, they are somehow restricted because they are giving the full power for cross-border consultation to the national MSP contact points. Public authorities are responsible for that. And public authorities in each country, they are deciding how to organize consultation with stakeholders in a given country. So there is a dominance of these national MSP authorities. But this was the only feasible solution when we discussed, because I was responsible for preparation of those guidelines. So I presented drafts of those guidelines. So this was the only feasible solution to find a process which will work. And here you can see how it was in Poland. So here is a planning process in Poland, and those red dots, they are showing the international meeting. So as you can see, the first international meeting was before first national meeting. It was done when we started this very early stage in 2016. And during this meeting, we described what would be the nature of Polish planning, how it would look like, what we want to achieve, what are our ambition goals. Then in the second meeting, international meeting, it was very close to the second Polish national meeting. Here we presented the draft number 0. So in draft number 0, you can see the main goals, objectives, but also the first preliminary allocation of this space to different uses. And then when we have the final meeting, with Polish final national meeting back to back with, so it was one day earlier, there was a third international meeting. You can see here the third international meeting photo, and all countries, they could see Polish plan and they could discuss this plan together with us, and they could send to us remarks and we should respond to those remarks. So here you have the steps for making those cross-border consultations within neighboring countries. What is stipulated by the guidelines is the full responsibility of making consultations is in the hands of MSP national authorities. So, for example, if we are doing plan in Poland, we are asking Swedish counterpart, asking SWAM, this agency responsible for MSP in Sweden, for launching stakeholder process in Sweden. We are providing Sweden with relevant documents, and Sweden is deciding whether they want to send this document in English or they want to translate it in Swedish, but they are also deciding to whom they will send it, what stakeholders are relevant, because as remember, the border between Polish and Sweden is the middle of the sea. So the Swedish authorities, they are deciding which stakeholders they will be involved. And then the result of the stakeholder process, and then communicate the result to the Polish authorities responsible for MSP. And then when we receive those input from Sweden, we should look on that here in Poland. And according to the guidelines, we should respond to each suggestion, whether it was taken or it was rejected, and if it was rejected, why it was rejected. During the Polish plan, we should provide the reason. So this is the steps, how those consultations should be organized. And this, you know, I use the Swedish example, but the same should be done in other countries which are affected by Polish plans, for example, by Germany, by Denmark, or because we have a sea border with Germany, Denmark, also in Russia, but in Russia it's a problem because here we are a little bit slightly missing those MSP authorities. There is a suggestion in the guidelines that should be a consultation strategy. And what is important about this consultation strategy is something which has not happened during Polish MSP. So it is said in the strategy that perhaps authorities responsible for preparation of MSP in given countries, or Polish authorities developing plan, should be ready to travel to other countries to somehow present the plan, to discuss. So this is a kind of very important statement for direct face-to-face contacts. Perhaps it's not easy. I know that in some cross-border consultation, for example, between Latvia and Lithuania, it was the case. But also the language issue is important. So because of this different planning cultures, so some terms which are clear in Poland for a local plan or something like that might be not clear in other countries. So here, this consultation strategy, the attention should be paid to the proper translation of this technical language of MSP, that it could be understandable for the stakeholders in other countries. And this is the most important about the strategy, but also here in this cross-border level, the informal contacts, they are underlined. So we're doing this formal consultation via MSP authorities, but also what is said that even we have this BSR cooperation. While meeting WASAP Helcom, we have a project. It would be great to have informal contacts also between the countries. This is the case because we have different cross-border planning fora. For example, there is a common planning effort on the border of Poland and Germany, and this is both land border and terrestrial border and sea border. And here we have a lot of informal discussion, even it was a preparation of a kind of strategy or vision for development of this cross-border area between Poland and Germany, including the sea. So here, these guidelines, it's a repetitive message. We should speak, we should try to understand each other, we should be open to the concerns of other countries. So we should not limit this contact, I mean, this consultations, we should not limit those cross-border level, we should not limit to discussion of the formal planning documents. That's the main message. And here I'm putting those two perspectives together. And here you can see how it works. So dominating role of national competent authorities, but they should involve this NGOs, local authorities, other organizations, and transnational dialogue or cross-border dialogue is going through those MSP contact points, those national authorities responsible for MSP. So this is, the structure which is then followed in the guidelines, but this picture is from the Participate project. So here at this slide, you can see that each level is expected to contribute to this consultations on MSP. So not only countries which are neighboring countries, cross-border level, but also Baltic level, EU global level. But also we should involve in those consultation local, regional, and national authorities. And you can see that at each planning stage, we have different expectations, we have different tasks. So for example, EU global level, here you can see that those tasks are mainly related to screening the resources, to looking on the documents, looking for data. If we are talking about asking stakeholders' opinions, so here we have more national level, regional level, but also local level. But you can see that this should be done at each stage of the MSP plan. And here there is a final slide from the Land Sea Act. So it's a project which is running now. And in this slide, the key issue is that stakeholders' involvement, multi-level stakeholders' involvement from different levels, from different experience of those terrestrial sea stakeholders, is of key importance for the proper planning stage. So my experience from planning is that during different planning stages of development of plans, and I don't know, but perhaps also implementation and evaluation, we should use the stakeholders' tacit knowledge, stakeholders' experience, stakeholders' know-how. And this is very important because we as a planners, we are not aware of all the consequences of our plan. Only in this dialogue, we can realize what should be changed, what is not working, and how to ensure, because this is the most important issue, how to ensure, for example, proper interlinkages between spatial planning on land and on sea, or proper interlinkages between spatial planning and economic development. And this is not trivial, because we started from this first slide when I showed to you different plans. We are preparing these plans. We are pretty sure that those plans are coherent, but only when those plans will start working, we can accumulate experience, whether there are some contradictions or whether there are synergies which we think they should be, or something should be changed. This is constant. So we have this cycle here. Work with stakeholders is the main vehicle for making BSR planning coherent, logical, and providing benefits which are expected from Meritis spatial planning. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that now this cross-border and BSR cooperation, or those efforts, are closer to your heart, and then I can encourage you to be part of this feedback loop, because I hope that you, my MSP stakeholders, you are listening to this lecture. Thank you very much.